Martha Johnson woke up to the warm glow of sunlight filtering through the cream-colored curtains of her suburban home. The morning air was crisp, and the faint scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen hinted at Jonathan's usual routine. She smiled, brushing a lock of auburn hair from her face, thinking how idyllic her life had become. Their marriage of 10 years had its challenges, but Martha took pride in the family and community they had built together. Today was supposed to be no different. As she descended the staircase, she noticed Jonathan already dressed for work. His tailored suit was impeccable as always, and he greeted her with a quick kiss on the cheek. "Morning, sweetheart," he said with his trademark charm. Martha admired how composed he always seemed, his charisma a beacon in their social circles. "I'll get breakfast ready," she replied, heading to the kitchen. But as she reached for the coffee pot, her eyes caught something odd, a faint red smudge on the collar of Jonathan's crisp white shirt hanging over the chair. She froze, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. Lipstick. The shade wasn't hers. Her heart began to race. Martha quickly told herself it must be a misunderstanding. Maybe it was an accidental brush during one of Jonathan's countless meetings. She shook her head and continued preparing breakfast, determined to confront him later. The day went by in a haze. Martha busied herself with her volunteer work at the local community center, but her thoughts remained clouded by the mysterious stain. By evening, when Jonathan returned, her resolve had solidified. "Jonathan," she said as they sat at the dining table, her voice steady but edged with tension. "I found something odd on your shirt this morning." He glanced up from his plate, his expression flickering just slightly. "What do you mean?" "This," she said, holding up the shirt. "Lipstick. Care to explain?" For a moment, silence filled the room. Jonathan's confident demeanor cracked as he stumbled for a response. "All that? It's nothing. Probably from someone at the office." He stopped, realizing the excuse sounded feeble even to him. Martha felt the air leave her lungs. "Don't insult me, Jonathan," she said, her voice trembling. "Who is it?" Jonathan hesitated, his silence confirming her worst fears. The man she thought she knew, the man she trusted, was hiding something. Her vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She needed to know the truth. Her suspicions led her to Cynthia Harper, her best friend of 15 years. The pieces started falling into place. Cynthia's sudden cancellations, her vague excuses about work, the way she avoided eye contact when Jonathan was around. Unable to bear the weight of her doubts, Martha confronted Cynthia the next day. She met her at their favorite cafe, where they had shared countless conversations and laughter over the years. But today the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. "Cynthia," Martha began, her voice cracking, "I need to ask you something, and I want the truth." Cynthia looked up, startled by the seriousness in Martha's tone. "Of course, what is it?" Martha reached into her purse, pulling out the shirt. "This," she said, her voice a mix of hurt and accusation. "Is this yours?" The color drained from Cynthia's face. She opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it, unable to find the words. Her silence spoke volumes. "How long?" Martha whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" Cynthia's face contorted with guilt and shame. "Martha, I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" Martha's voice rose, drawing stares from nearby patrons. "You were my best friend. My confidant. How could you?" Cynthia's excuses blurred into the background as Martha's mind spiraled. The betrayal hit like a freight train, shattering every cherished memory she had of their friendship and marriage. She stormed out of the cafe, her heart breaking with each step. That evening, as Martha sat alone in the living room, she felt the walls of her once perfect life closing in. The picture frames lining the mantel now seemed like cruel reminders of a lie. Her mind swirled with anger, grief, and a burgeoning sense of determination. She couldn't let Jonathan and Cynthia's betrayal define her. The storm brewing in Martha's heart had broken loose, and the woman who had once lived for the approval of others began to see the world differently. Her tears dried, replaced by a steely resolve. This was only the beginning. Martha stared out the window of her sunlit kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug. The betrayal gnawed at her, its weight almost unbearable. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a hollow shell, each corner echoing with memories now tainted by lies. Jonathan's affair wasn't just an infidelity, it was a fracture in the foundation of her life. She was determined not to crumble under its weight. For hours she wandered through the house, lost in thought. As she moved through the living room, her eyes fell on a framed photograph of her and Jonathan at a gala years ago. In it, he smiled broadly, his hand possessively resting on her shoulder. The image now felt like a mockery. She slammed the frame down on the table, the glass cracking under the force. "Lies," she muttered to herself. "Every bit of it." Martha's initial instinct was to confront Jonathan publicly, but the idea felt unsatisfying. Exposing his infidelity might wound him socially, but it wouldn't be enough. She wanted him to feel the depth of her pain, to lose everything he valued, the way she had lost her trust, her dignity, and her peace. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Bradley, their longtime chauffeur, stepped out of the sleek black sedan, his hat tucked under his arm. Bradley had worked for the family for nearly a decade, and though their interactions had always been polite, they had never ventured beyond surface-level conversations. Curious, Martha stepped out onto the porch. "Bradley, do you have a moment?" she called out. Bradley stopped mid-step, his face betraying surprise. "Of course, Mrs. Johnson. Is everything all right?" Martha gestured for him to follow her inside. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, she noticed the weariness in his eyes, a tiredness that mirrored her own. "Bradley, how long have you worked for us?" she asked, her voice even. 10 years, ma'am," he replied, a hint of pride in his tone. "Since Mr. Johnson hired me right after his promotion. And in all those years, have you ever found him difficult to work for?" Her question hung in the air, heavier than she intended. Bradley hesitated, clearly weighing his response. "Mr. Johnson can be demanding, ma'am," he said carefully. "He expects perfection and he's not always kind about it." Martha nodded, her suspicion confirmed. "He's hurt me in ways I didn't think were possible, Bradley. And I want to do something about it. But I can't do it alone." Bradley's expression shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowing. "What are you thinking, ma'am?" For the first time in days, Martha felt the stirrings of hope. She could see in Bradley's eyes a man who had endured Jonathan's harshness for years. There was a quiet strength in him, a resilience that matched her own. If anyone understood her desire for justice, it was him. "I need to bring Jonathan down," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for the affair but for everything he's done, to me, to others. I want to uncover every lie, every scheme. And I think you can help me." Bradley studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Jonathan isn't as untouchable as he thinks. There are cracks in his facade, Mrs. Johnson. If you're serious about this, I'm with you." Their pact was sealed with a firm handshake, and from that moment, a plan began to take shape. Bradley provided insight into Jonathan's routines, his shady dealings, and the ways he abused his power both at home and at work. Together, they started piecing together the puzzle of Jonathan's life, identifying weak points they could exploit. Bradley also revealed details about how Jonathan mistreated employees at his company, underpaying staff, cutting corners, and falsifying reports to inflate profits. "He's got more skeletons in his closet than most cemeteries," Bradley said grimly. Over the following weeks, Martha and Bradley worked in secret. Martha began attending Jonathan's corporate events under the guise of playing the supportive wife, using the opportunity to listen carefully to conversations and gather information. Bradley, meanwhile, discreetly monitored Jonathan's movements, noting the locations and times of meetings that seemed out of the ordinary. One evening, Martha returned home with a file she had taken from Jonathan's office, a collection of documents labeled confidential. As she spread the papers across the dining table, Bradley joined her, and they pored over the evidence. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Jonathan was involved in fraudulent business practices that, if exposed, could ruin him. "This is it," Martha said, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and fear. "This is what we need to destroy him." Bradley nodded. "But we have to be careful. If he finds out what we're doing, he won't just let it go." Martha understood the risk. Jonathan was ruthless, and if he felt cornered, he wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. But the thought of backing down never crossed her mind. Her betrayal had transformed her. No longer the meek, accommodating wife, she was now a force to be reckoned with. As the days turned into weeks, their plan gained momentum. Martha's anger sharpened her focus, and Bradley's loyalty provided the steady support she needed. Together, they prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Jonathan, knowing it would be a battle like no other. Martha's resolve hardened as she stared at the stack of evidence before her. She had been wronged, humiliated, and betrayed, but she refused to be a victim any longer. With Bradley by her side, she was ready to take on the man who had destroyed her world. The storm was brewing, and Martha was determined to ensure that when it broke, Jonathan would be left in ruins. The opulent ballroom shimmered with gold and crystal accents as the guests mingled, their laughter and murmurs blending with the soft hum of a string quartet. It was one of the city's most exclusive social gatherings, and Martha stood at its center, a glass of champagne in hand. She was dressed in a striking emerald gown that caught the light with every movement, her head held high. Tonight was the night she would make her announcement, a moment that would shift the balance of power in ways no one expected. Across the room, Jonathan held court, surrounded by a group of colleagues. He exuded his usual charm, his laughter a little too loud, his gestures a little too rehearsed. Martha watched him from a distance, her lips curling into a faint smile. He didn't know what was coming. Beside her, Bradley adjusted his tie, looking distinctly out of place in the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. His presence was understated, but his quiet strength anchored Martha amidst the judgmental stares and whispers that followed them wherever they went. She turned to him, her gaze steady. "Are you ready for this?" He nodded. "Are you?" Martha took a deep breath and stepped forward, tapping her glass lightly to capture the room's attention. The soft tinkling sound cut through the chatter, and one by one, heads turned toward her. Jonathan's laughter died mid-sentence as his eyes met hers, his expression shifting from amusement to mild irritation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martha began, her voice clear and confident, "thank you all for joining us tonight. As many of you know, this past year has been transformative for me." A ripple of whispers coursed through the crowd, but Martha pressed on. "Life often takes us down unexpected paths, and I found myself on one such journey. It's a journey of rediscovery, of strength and, most importantly, of love." Jonathan's brow furrowed, his irritation deepening. Martha allowed herself a brief moment to savor his confusion before delivering the blow. "I'm delighted to announce my engagement to Bradley Harrison." The room erupted into murmurs and gasps. Jonathan's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Cynthia, who stood at his side, let out a disbelieving laugh, her expression a mixture of shock and disdain. Martha turned to Bradley, who stepped forward and took her hand, his posture unshaken despite the scrutiny. Together, they presented an image of quiet defiance that sent a clear message. This was no accident, no whim. It was a deliberate declaration of independence and a challenge to the man who had betrayed her. Jonathan strode forward, his expression unreadable but his eyes blazing with anger. "Martha," he said, his voice low but laced with condescension, "can I have a word?" She tilted her head slightly, her smile never faltering. "Of course." He led her to a corner of the room, away from prying ears, and turned on her. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice barely controlled. "I think it's obvious," she replied smoothly. "I'm moving on." "Moving on?" he repeated incredulously. "With the chauffeur? Are you out of your mind?" Martha's smile widened, her eyes sparkling with a mix of amusement and defiance. "You didn't think I'd let you and Cynthia have all the fun, did you?" Jonathan's face twisted with anger, but he quickly masked it with a thin veneer of composure. "This is a joke. A stunt. No one's going to take you seriously." "Funny," she said, her tone sharp. "That's exactly what I thought about you and Cynthia." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment Jonathan had no response. Martha took the opportunity to step past him, leaving him to stew in his own fury. Across the room, Cynthia watched the scene unfold, her hands clenched around the stem of her champagne glass. Her jealousy was palpable, and Martha relished the sight. For years, Cynthia had basked in her proximity to Martha's life, feeding off her trust while secretly coveting what she had. Now, the tables had turned, and Martha was determined to savor every moment of her former friend's discomfort. As the evening progressed, the announcement became the sole topic of conversation. Guests whispered behind their glasses, speculating on Martha's motivations and ridiculing her choice of fiancé. But amidst the judgment, Martha stood tall, her resolve unshaken. She had expected the backlash and welcomed it. It was a small price to pay for reclaiming her narrative. Bradley, ever the steady presence, leaned toward her as the night drew to a close. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I couldn't have done it without you." Their partnership had evolved into something deeper than either of them had anticipated. What had started as a calculated alliance was beginning to feel like genuine companionship, a bond forged in the fires of betrayal and determination. As they left the ballroom hand in hand, Martha felt a sense of liberation she hadn't experienced in years. She had taken the first bold step toward dismantling Jonathan's control, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the woman who let others dictate her life. Jonathan watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. This was far from over. The room was dark except for the pale glow of a desk lamp illuminating the papers strewn across Martha's mahogany desk. She sat in the chair, her fingers tracing over a spreadsheet of numbers and transactions that didn't add up. The silence of the night wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Across from her, Bradley leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he scanned a stack of documents. His normally calm demeanor was replaced by a look of quiet intensity. "These records, they're worse than I thought," he said, his voice low. Martha nodded, her gaze never leaving the paper in her hand. "Jonathan's been siphoning money into offshore accounts. It's not just fraud, it's embezzlement. And the scale of it," she trailed off, her mind racing. "It's massive," Bradley finished, shaking his head. "If this comes to light, it won't just ruin him, it'll destroy the company." Martha exhaled sharply, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. For weeks, she had suspected Jonathan of more than just infidelity. His arrogance, his increasingly secretive behavior, and the inconsistencies in their finances had painted a troubling picture. Now, the pieces were falling into place, and the truth was even darker than she had imagined. "This is just the start," Martha said, her voice steadier now. "If we dig deeper, we'll find more. Enough to make sure he answers for everything." Bradley set the papers down and met her gaze. "Are you ready for what this will mean? If Jonathan finds out what we're doing?" "He won't," Martha interrupted firmly. "Not until it's too late." The investigation began in earnest. During the day, Martha played her role as the poised ex-wife-to-be, appearing at social events and maintaining the illusion of normalcy. At night, she and Bradley worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence they needed to bring Jonathan down. Martha used her connections within the social elite to subtly gather information. She feigned interest in idle gossip, fishing for hints about Jonathan's dealings. At the same time, Bradley, with his intimate knowledge of Jonathan's habits and routines, managed to access files and emails that Jonathan thought were well hidden. One evening, Bradley arrived at the house carrying a locked briefcase. "This just came in," he said, setting it on the desk. "I managed to pull these from his office while he was out." Martha's fingers hesitated on the clasp. "What's in here?" Bradley gave her a grim look. "Bank statements. Contracts. Enough to paint a very clear picture of what he's been up to." As Martha sifted through the contents, her anger boiled. Page after page detailed Jonathan's schemes. Money laundered through fake companies, backdoor deals with shady investors, and massive sums diverted to personal accounts. It was all there, laid bare in black and white. But one document caught her eye, a contract with a company name she didn't recognize. "What's this?" she murmured, holding it up to the light. Bradley leaned over her shoulder. "That's one of his shell companies. He uses it to funnel money into other accounts. It's registered under a fake name, but the signature is his." Martha's jaw tightened. This wasn't just greed, it was criminal. As the weeks passed, Martha and Bradley compiled a damning dossier. Every transaction, every fraudulent contract, every connection to illegal activity was carefully documented. The evidence was overwhelming, and Martha knew it was enough to bring Jonathan to his knees. One night, as they sat in the dimly lit study, Bradley broke the silence. "We have enough now. The question is, how do we use it?" Martha stared at the papers spread before her, her mind churning with possibilities. "We can't just hand this over to the authorities," she said slowly. "Not yet. If we do, he'll find a way to spin it. He always does." "Then what's the plan?" Bradley asked. Martha leaned back in her chair, a spark of determination in her eyes. "We go public. We expose him in a way he can't recover from. And we make sure the fallout is devastating." Bradley nodded, his respect for her growing with every word. "You've thought this through?" "I've had to," she replied, her voice steely. "Jonathan thrives on power and reputation. If we take that away, he'll have nothing left." The first step was to leak select pieces of information to the media. Anonymous tips about Jonathan's offshore accounts and shady deals began to circulate, creating whispers of scandal in the corporate world. At the same time, Martha started planting seeds of doubt among Jonathan's business associates, subtly hinting at his financial mismanagement. Jonathan, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, carried on as usual. He dismissed the rumors as baseless gossip, confident in his ability to control the narrative. But Martha knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks became impossible to ignore. As the day of the reveal approached, Martha and Bradley worked tirelessly to ensure every detail was perfect. They coordinated with investigative journalists, prepared legal documents, and even rehearsed the public statement Martha would make. It was a meticulous operation, and every moment brought them closer to their goal. On the eve of the planned exposure, Martha stood in the study, staring at the dossier that had consumed her life for months. Bradley entered the room, his expression serious. "Are you ready for this?" She turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "More than ever." The next day would mark the beginning of the end for Jonathan, and the start of Martha's fight for justice. The morning air was heavy with the scent of rain, the skies overcast as if nature itself sensed the sorrow that was about to unfold. Martha sat on the edge of her bed, the faint sound of distant thunder echoing through the room. She held a framed ultrasound image close to her chest, a bittersweet reminder of what could have been. For weeks, she had thrown herself into the fight against Jonathan with a single-minded determination. The evidence she and Bradley had gathered was meticulously organized, the plans for exposure underway. It had given her purpose, a way to channel her pain. But amidst the storm of betrayal and revenge, she had clung to one bright hope, her child. That hope had been taken from her the day before. The doctor's words still echoed in her ears. "I'm so sorry, Martha. There was nothing we could do." She had sat in the sterile office, numb with shock as the weight of the loss crushed her. Bradley had driven her home in silence, his hand resting gently on hers as she stared out the window, tears streaming silently down her face. Now, as the rain began to patter against the windows, Martha's grief swelled. She felt hollow, as if a part of her soul had been torn away. The pain was different from the betrayal she had endured with Jonathan. It was raw, visceral, and all-consuming. There was a knock at the door, and Bradley's voice broke through the quiet. "Martha? May I come in?" She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath before responding. "Yes." He entered cautiously, his usual stoic demeanor softened by concern. "I just wanted to check on you," he said, sitting in a chair across from her. I know this is unbearable." Martha nodded, unable to find the words. She set the ultrasound photo on the nightstand, her gaze fixed on it as if looking at it too long would shatter her completely. "Take your time," Bradley said gently. "We don't have to do anything today. The plan can wait." But Martha shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "No, it can't wait. Jonathan doesn't get to win, not after everything he's taken from me." Bradley frowned, concern etched in his features. "Are you sure? You've been through so much." "I'm sure," she interrupted, her eyes blazing with a newfound intensity. "This isn't just about revenge anymore, Bradley. It's about justice. For me. For my child. For everyone Jonathan has hurt." Her words hung in the air, heavy with resolve. Bradley nodded, recognizing the strength in her despite the pain she carried. "All right," he said. "Then let's make sure this counts." The following days were a blur of preparation, punctuated by moments of overwhelming grief. Martha worked tirelessly, pouring every ounce of her energy into the mission. At night, she allowed herself to mourn, curling up in the nursery she had started to prepare, the empty crib a stark reminder of what she had lost. Bradley was a constant presence, offering quiet support without overstepping. He knew that words wouldn't ease her pain, so he focused on action, helping her sift through the final pieces of evidence, coordinating with journalists and ensuring their plan was airtight. One evening as they worked in the study, Martha paused and looked up from her laptop. "Bradley," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "do you ever think about what it all means? Everything we're doing?" He set down the papers in his hands and leaned back in his chair. "I think about it every day. And I think, sometimes you have to fight for what's right no matter how hard it is. You're doing that, Martha. And it matters." His words brought a flicker of warmth to her chest, a small reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She nodded, her resolve solidifying once more. "Thank you," she said softly. The day of the reveal arrived with an almost eerie stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, muted sky. Martha stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her blazer with steady hands. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a symbol of strength and professionalism that would leave no room for doubt about her determination. Bradley appeared in the doorway holding a small envelope. "The final copies," he said. "The journalists are ready. Once you give the word, it's out there." Martha took the envelope and met his gaze. "This is it," she said, more to herself than to him. "It is," Bradley agreed. "And you're ready?" She nodded, tucking the envelope into her bag. The weight of the moment settled on her, but instead of fear, she felt a quiet calm. The pain of her loss would always be with her, but it had become a part of her strength. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the memory of what she had lost and for a future where Jonathan couldn't harm anyone else. As she stepped out of the house, Bradley by her side, Martha felt a flicker of hope amidst the grief. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face it head-on. For her child. For herself. For justice. The courthouse loomed ahead, its grand stone facade a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. Martha stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward in search of a statement. Bradley stayed close, his presence a quiet reassurance amidst the chaos. "Mrs. Johnson, do you have any comments on the charges against Jonathan? Is it true you uncovered the evidence yourself? Do you expect a conviction?" Martha ignored the barrage of questions, her focus unyielding. This day wasn't about her words, it was about the truth finally seeing the light of day. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. The gallery was packed, reporters, corporate executives, and curious onlookers eager to witness the downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Jonathan sat at the defense table, his jaw set and his expression defiant. His lawyer, a well-known shark in the legal world, whispered something to him, but Jonathan didn't respond. Martha took her seat among the prosecutors, her hands folded in her lap. The files she and Bradley had spent months compiling now rested in the hands of a skilled legal team. This was the moment she had fought for, a chance to hold Jonathan accountable. The judge entered and the room fell silent. The trial began with the prosecution presenting its case, each piece of evidence building a damning narrative. Martha listened intently as the prosecutor outlined Jonathan's web of deceit, fraudulent contracts, embezzlement schemes, and offshore accounts designed to hide millions. Each revelation was like a hammer blow, chipping away at Jonathan's carefully constructed image. As the prosecution called its first witness, Martha's heart quickened. It was one of Jonathan's former employees, a timid man in his 40s who had worked in the finance department. His voice trembled as he recounted how Jonathan had pressured him to falsify records. "He said if I didn't do it, I'd lose my job," the man testified, his eyes darting nervously. I didn't know what else to do." Jonathan's lawyer objected, claiming the testimony was speculative, but the judge overruled. The cracks in Jonathan's defense were beginning to show. The trial dragged on for days, each session uncovering more of Jonathan's betrayal. Martha sat through it all, her emotions a turbulent mix of vindication and heartbreak. She had always known Jonathan was capable of deceit, but the sheer extent of his actions was staggering. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the lives he had destroyed in his pursuit of power. One particularly damning piece of evidence came when the prosecution presented emails between Jonathan and a shell company. The correspondence detailed plans to siphon funds from the company's pension program, jeopardizing the futures of countless employees. The gallery erupted in whispers, and Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time, Martha saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. It wasn't just his reputation on the line, it was his freedom. As the trial continued, Martha found herself grappling with the emotional toll of the revelations. She had spent years married to this man, sharing a life she thought was built on mutual respect. Now she was forced to confront the reality that much of it had been a lie. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Bradley found her sitting alone in the courthouse corridor. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with weariness. "Rough day," he said, sitting beside her. She nodded, letting out a heavy sigh. "Hearing it all laid out like that, it's like I'm reliving every betrayal all over again." Bradley placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Martha. You're the reason this is happening. Don't forget that." His words were a balm to her raw emotions, and she offered him a faint smile. "Thank you, Bradley. For everything." The defense finally rested its case, but their arguments had been thin and unconvincing. The weight of the evidence against Jonathan was too great, and it was clear the jury wasn't buying his lawyer's attempts to spin the narrative. As the trial drew to a close, the prosecutor delivered a powerful closing statement, urging the jury to hold Jonathan accountable for his actions. "This is not just about fraud or theft," she said, her voice resonating through the courtroom. "This is about a man who believed he was above the law, a man who used his power to exploit, manipulate, and destroy. It's time to send a message that no one is untouchable." Jonathan's lawyer offered a final rebuttal, but the energy in the room had shifted. The tide was no longer in Jonathan's favor. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Martha held her breath as the foreperson stood and read the verdict. "Guilty." The word echoed through the room, and for a moment, Martha felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. She closed her eyes, a rush of relief and vindication washing over her. Justice had been served. Jonathan's face was a mask of fury and disbelief as the judge pronounced the sentence. 30 years in prison. The gallery buzzed with murmurs and the reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Martha stood as the judge adjourned the court. As she walked toward the exit, she felt a strange sense of closure. The fight wasn't over, but this victory was a crucial step in reclaiming her life. Outside the courthouse, Bradley was waiting. "You did it," he said with a smile. "No," Martha replied, her gaze steady. "We did it." Together, they stepped into the sunlight, leaving the shadow of Jonathan's betrayal behind. The aftermath of the trial sent shockwaves through the city's social and corporate circles. Jonathan's conviction was the talk of every newsroom, boardroom, and social gathering. His once loyal allies scrambled to distance themselves from the wreckage, fearing they might be implicated in his schemes. Among those allies, Cynthia found herself facing a storm of her own. Martha hadn't seen Cynthia since the announcement of her engagement to Bradley. The humiliation on Cynthia's face that night had been etched into Martha's memory, but it was nothing compared to the shame she was about to face. Cornered by reporters, financial scrutiny, and whispers of her involvement in Jonathan's crimes, Cynthia had no choice but to act. The call came late one evening. Martha was in the middle of reviewing a report about Jonathan's pension fraud when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and froze. Cynthia's name glowed back at her, a ghost from the past. Against her better judgment, Martha answered. "What do you want, Cynthia?" There was a pause, then a shaky breath. "Martha, please. I need to talk to you." "Talk to me?" Martha's voice hardened. "After everything you've done?" "I know I don't deserve it," Cynthia said quickly, her tone desperate. "But I have information about Jonathan. Information that could change everything." Martha hesitated. Every instinct told her to hang up, but curiosity got the better of her. "Fine. Where?" The cafe was nearly empty when Martha arrived. Cynthia sat at a corner table, her once polished appearance noticeably diminished. Her hair was unkempt, and her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. As Martha approached, Cynthia looked up, a flicker of hope crossing her face. Martha didn't bother with pleasantries. "This better be worth my time." "It is," Cynthia replied, pushing a folder across the table. "I've been keeping this for months, ever since Jonathan started pulling me into his schemes. I didn't know how far it went until it was too late." Martha opened the folder and scanned the contents. Inside were contracts, emails, and notes that detailed Jonathan's deeper connections to illegal activity, shady partnerships, bribes, and even threats to silence those who opposed him. The evidence was damning. "This is enough to bury him even further," Martha said, closing the folder and fixing Cynthia with a cold stare. "Why now?" Cynthia's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup. "Because they're coming for me too, Martha. The prosecutors, the media, they think I'm just as guilty as he is. I had to make a deal to save myself." Martha's lip curled in disgust. "So this isn't about doing the right thing. It's about self-preservation." Cynthia didn't deny it. "Maybe it is. But it doesn't change the fact that this will help you." Martha leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To my life?" "I do," Cynthia whispered, her voice cracking. "And I'm sorry, Martha. I truly am. I never wanted to hurt you. Didn't you?" Martha snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing every time you saw me, every time you smiled in my face while you were sleeping with my husband. You destroyed everything." Tears welled in Cynthia's eyes. "I was selfish, jealous. I envied you, Martha. Your life, your strength, your happiness. I thought if I took a piece of it for myself, I'd feel whole. But I was wrong." Martha's chest tightened. She had imagined this confrontation so many times, but now that it was happening, it felt hollow. She searched Cynthia's face for sincerity and found only a broken woman grasping for redemption. "You don't get to play the victim," Martha said, her voice steady. "You betrayed me. You betrayed yourself. And now you're dealing with the consequences." Cynthia's tears spilled over, but she nodded. "I know. And I'll live with that for the rest of my life. But I can at least do one thing right, by giving you this." Martha stared at her for a long moment before standing. She picked up the folder and tucked it under her arm. "I don't forgive you, Cynthia. And I don't know if I ever will." Cynthia looked up at her, desperation mingling with acceptance. "I understand." Without another word, Martha turned and walked out of the cafe, the weight of the folder heavy in her arms. Outside, the evening air was crisp and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. The pain Cynthia had caused would never fully fade, but it no longer controlled her. She had reclaimed her power, and nothing, not even Cynthia's betrayal, could take that away. That night, Martha met with the prosecution team, handing over the new evidence. The lead prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, reviewed the documents and nodded approvingly. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "It'll seal Jonathan's fate." Martha felt a wave of relief. Cynthia's betrayal had come full circle, and while it didn't erase the pain, it brought her one step closer to justice. As she left the prosecutor's office, Bradley was waiting by the car. "How did it go?" he asked. Martha smiled faintly. "Better than I expected." He opened the car door for her, and as she slid into the seat, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. Cynthia had played her part in Jonathan's downfall, but more importantly, she had shown Martha the strength she had gained through the pain. As they drove away, Martha looked out at the city lights, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The shadows of betrayal were fading, and in their place she saw the glimmers of a brighter future. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the judge entered, his robes flowing and his expression stern. The air was charged with anticipation. Today would mark the conclusion of one of the most scandalous trials in the city's history. Martha sat in the gallery, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Bradley offered a reassuring nod, his steady presence anchoring her in the storm of emotions swirling within her. At the defense table, Jonathan stood as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. His once confident demeanor had crumbled over the weeks of the trial. The weight of the evidence, the fraudulent contracts, the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, had left his defense team scrambling for leniency. But Jonathan's hubris, his belief that he could outmaneuver anyone, had been his undoing. "Jonathan Richard Daniels," the judge intoned, his voice resonating through the room, "you have been found guilty of multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Your actions have caused immeasurable harm to countless individuals, including your employees, your investors, and your own family." Jonathan's jaw clenched, but he kept his gaze forward. He refused to look at Martha, though her presence loomed over him like a specter. "The court hereby sentences you to 30 years in federal prison," the judge continued. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a flurry of murmurs. "This sentence reflects the severity of your crimes and serves as a reminder that no one is above the law." The gavel struck and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits to break the story, while Jonathan's lawyer placed a hand on his client's shoulder in a futile attempt at consolation. Jonathan, for the first time, seemed truly defeated. His shoulders slumped and his gaze fell to the floor. Martha remained seated, her expression unreadable. This was the moment she had fought for, the culmination of months of pain, effort, and resolve. Yet, as the weight of the verdict settled over her, she found herself grappling with an unexpected hollowness. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters waited, cameras flashing and microphones poised. Martha stepped into the sunlight, shielding her eyes as she was immediately surrounded by questions. "Mrs. Daniels, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think 30 years is a fair sentence? What's next for you after this victory?" She raised a hand to silence the crowd. "Today's verdict is not about me," she said firmly. "It's about accountability. Jonathan's actions hurt many people and justice has been served. But this is not a moment for celebration, it's a moment for reflection. I hope this serves as a warning to those who think they can exploit others for their own gain." Her words were met with a flurry of camera clicks and shouted follow-ups, but she didn't stay to answer them. Bradley was waiting by the car and she made her way to him, her steps measured. As they drove away, Bradley glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You did what you set out to do," he said. "You should be proud." Martha leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes fixed on the passing skyline. "I thought I'd feel something more," she admitted. "Vindication, relief, but all I feel is tired." "It's natural," Bradley said. "You've carried this for so long. Letting it go takes time." Martha nodded, but a shadow lingered in her heart. She had won the battle, but the war within her, questions of morality, vengeance, and the cost of her pursuit, remained unresolved. That evening, Martha sat alone in her study, the verdict replaying in her mind. She thought about the people Jonathan had hurt, the employees who had lost their pensions, the families affected by his greed, the colleagues he had betrayed. Justice had been served for them, and that gave her solace. But her thoughts inevitably turned inward. How much of her pursuit had been about justice, and how much had been driven by her own desire for revenge? She had exposed Jonathan, destroyed his reputation, and watched as the empire he had built crumbled around him. Yet the victories felt fleeting, unable to fill the void left by his betrayal and the personal losses she had endured. Her gaze fell on a photograph on her desk, her late child's ultrasound. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the edges of the frame with her fingers. That loss had fueled her resolve, had given her the strength to fight when the weight of everything threatened to crush her. But it had also left her questioning the cost of that fight. A knock at the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she called, quickly wiping her eyes. Bradley entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "I thought you could use this," he said, setting one on the desk in front of her. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He took a seat across from her, studying her carefully. "You've been through hell and back, Martha. It's okay to feel conflicted." She met his gaze, her own filled with uncertainty. "Did I do the right thing, Bradley? Or did I let my anger consume me?" "You did what needed to be done," he said without hesitation. "Jonathan made his choices and he hurt a lot of people. You didn't ruin him, he ruined himself. All you did was shine a light on the truth." His words brought a measure of comfort, though the questions lingered. Martha knew the road to healing would be long, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Jonathan's conviction continued to ripple through the city. His assets were seized, his company dismantled, and his name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Meanwhile, Martha began to rebuild her life, focusing on her own path forward. She donated a significant portion of her divorce settlement to charities supporting victims of corporate fraud, turning her pain into purpose. She also started a foundation to help women in vulnerable situations, a project that brought her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Through it all, Bradley remained by her side, a steadfast ally and friend. Together, they looked toward a future free from the shadow of Jonathan's betrayal. For the first time in a long time, Martha felt a glimmer of hope. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the windows of Martha's new office, casting a warm glow over the minimalist yet inviting space. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of women smiling, their eyes filled with hope. In the corner stood a sleek wooden desk where Martha sat, reviewing a grant proposal for the foundation she had poured her heart into. The Martha Daniels Foundation had been born from her pain but fueled by her determination to make a difference. Its mission was simple yet profound: to support women escaping toxic relationships, rebuild their lives and reclaim their strength. It offered financial assistance, counseling services and vocational training, practical tools to empower those who had been overlooked and underestimated, much like Martha once had been. Bradley knocked on the open door, a stack of files in his hand. "Busy morning?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. Martha looked up, her own smile soft but genuine. "Always. But it's a good kind of busy." He placed the files on her desk and took a seat across from her. "The community center we partnered with is holding an event next month," he said. "They're asking if you'd be willing to speak." Martha hesitated for a moment. Public speaking had never been her forte, but the foundation's message was bigger than her comfort zone. "Of course," she said, nodding. "If my story can inspire even one woman to take that first step, it'll be worth it." Bradley's expression grew serious. "You're doing something incredible here, Martha. You've turned everything you went through into something meaningful. That's no small feat." Martha's gaze drifted to a photograph on her desk, a group of women standing in front of a newly renovated shelter, their faces alight with gratitude. "I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again," she admitted. "But seeing their lives change, it gives me hope. And purpose." The foundation quickly gained momentum, its reach extending beyond the local community. Martha's story, publicized after Jonathan's trial, resonated with women across the country. Donations poured in, and partnerships with other organizations flourished. One afternoon, Martha visited one of the shelters funded by the foundation. The building, once dilapidated, now buzzed with activity. In the common area, women gathered around tables, chatting and laughing as they worked on crafts or filled out job applications. A little girl with bright pigtails ran past, her giggles filling the room. Martha knelt to greet the child, who introduced herself with a shy smile. "I'm Ellie." "Well, Ellie," Martha said, her voice warm, "you have a beautiful laugh." Ellie's mother, standing nearby, approached with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "For this place, for everything. We wouldn't have made it without your help." Martha felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's arm. "You made it here on your own strength. We're just here to help you see it." The visit left Martha with a profound sense of fulfillment. For the first time in years, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. One evening, as she prepared for the community center event, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The betrayal, the trial, the loss, it had all shaped her into someone stronger, someone who could weather the storms of life and still find the courage to rebuild. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that cafe months ago, shattered by Jonathan and Cynthia's deceit. She had risen from the ashes of her old life, transformed by the fire that had once threatened to destroy her. At the event, the audience sat in rapt attention as Martha shared her story. She spoke of her struggles, her heartbreak, and her eventual decision to fight back, not just for herself but for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "Pain has a way of changing us," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It can break us or it can forge us into something stronger. The choice is ours. I chose to turn my pain into purpose, and I stand here today to tell you that you can too." The room erupted into applause, and as Martha stepped off the stage, women approached her with tears in their eyes, thanking her for her courage and inspiration. One young woman, clutching Martha's hand, said, "You gave me the strength to leave. I don't know where I'd be without you." Martha's heart swelled. In that moment, she realized the true power of her journey, not just in finding justice for herself, but in creating a legacy of hope that would ripple far beyond her own life. Later that night, back at her home, Martha sat on the porch with Bradley. The stars above them were brilliant, the night air crisp and calm. "You've come a long way," Bradley said, handing her a cup of tea. "We both have," Martha replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "I couldn't have done this without you." Bradley chuckled. "I think you give me too much credit. This was all you." Martha shook her head. "No, Bradley. It was us. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That made all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting. Martha knew there would always be challenges, always be memories that lingered, but she also knew she was no longer defined by them. She was free. As the stars twinkled above, Martha allowed herself a moment of peace, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The future stretched before her, filled with possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to every single one. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Martha's new home, bathing the room in golden light. She stood in the kitchen, a mug of coffee warming her hands as she gazed out at the garden. The space, once overgrown and neglected, was now vibrant with blooming flowers and neatly trimmed hedges, a reflection of her own transformation. It had been a year since Jonathan's sentencing, and life had taken on a steady rhythm. The foundation was thriving, helping more women than she could have imagined, and Martha had found herself surrounded by a community of people who truly supported her. The shadow of betrayal no longer loomed over her. Instead, she felt a quiet peace settling into her soul. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and Bradley entered, holding a clipboard. "Morning," he greeted, his smile easy. "You've got a busy day ahead as usual?" Martha laughed softly. "Don't I always? What's on the agenda?" He placed the clipboard on the counter and ran through the schedule. A meeting with a new donor, a ribbon-cutting ceremony for another shelter, and a small celebration marking the foundation's anniversary. It was a packed day, but Martha didn't mind. Each task felt purposeful, a far cry from the hollow obligations of her old life. "You're building something incredible, Martha," Bradley said, his tone serious. "Do you ever stop to think about how far you've come?" She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden again. "I do," she admitted. "And sometimes, it feels like a different lifetime. Like I was a different person." Bradley stepped closer, his expression warm. "You've always been strong. You just needed the chance to show it." Later that day, Martha stood in front of a crowd at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The shelter behind her was bustling with activity, its cheerful yellow exterior a beacon of hope for the women and children who sought refuge there. She held a pair of oversized scissors, ready to officially open the doors. "This shelter isn't just a building," she said, addressing the crowd. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together to support one another. It's a place where women can rebuild their lives, find their strength, and know they're not alone." With a swift cut, the ribbon fell away, and the crowd erupted into applause. Martha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. The shelter represented more than just a safe space. It was a symbol of her resilience and the power of turning pain into purpose. That evening, the foundation's anniversary celebration was held at a local community center. The room was filled with supporters, donors, and the women whose lives had been changed by the organization. Martha moved through the crowd, greeting familiar faces and thanking those who had helped her along the way. One young woman approached her hesitantly, a baby on her hip. "Mrs. Daniels," she began, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to say thank you. This foundation, it saved my life." It gave me and my son a chance to start over. Martha placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder, her smile genuine. You saved your own life. We just gave you the tools. And you're stronger than you know. The exchange reminded Martha of why she had started the foundation in the first place. It wasn't just about exposing Jonathan or reclaiming her power, it was about creating something lasting, something that could help others find their own strength. As the night wound down, Martha stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The air was cool and the twinkling lights below reminded her of how far she had come. Bradley joined her, a glass of wine in his hand. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, leaning on the railing beside her. She took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. "I'm just thinking about how grateful I am. For everything. Even the hard parts." Bradley raised an eyebrow. "Even Jonathan?" She nodded slowly. "Even Jonathan. He broke me in ways I didn't think were possible. But he also forced me to rebuild. And now, I'm stronger than I've ever been." Bradley smiled, raising his glass in a silent toast. "To new beginnings," he said. Martha clinked her glass against his, a soft laugh escaping her lips. To new beginnings? The following morning, Martha sat at her desk, reviewing plans for the foundation's expansion. Her life was no longer defined by betrayal or revenge, it was defined by purpose, by the lives she was helping to transform. She had found peace, not because she had erased the past, but because she had embraced it as part of her story. As she signed the final document, she looked up at the photograph on her desk, a picture of her standing with the women from the first shelter she had opened. Their smiles mirrored her own, a reflection of the hope she had found within herself. Martha leaned back in her chair, a contented sigh escaping her lips. The shadow of her old life had faded, replaced by the bright light of a future she had built with her own hands. And for the first time in years she felt free. Martha's journey was one of betrayal, resilience, and ultimately redemption. If you were in Martha's position, do you think you would have pursued justice as she did, or chosen a different path? What do you think about her decision to transform her pain into a mission to help others? Was justice fully served, or do you feel there's more to explore in her story? Share your thoughts, we'd love to hear your perspective. If Martha's story moved you or inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt narratives that explore the complexities of life, love, and personal growth. Your insights and feedback mean the world to us, so take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below.